Before I hand it over to Professor Jens Lerche, I just would like to give a small, brief introduction about his work. Uh, Professor Jens Lerche, whose work has profoundly shaped the field of agrarian studies, particularly in the Indian context. Professor Lerche holds MA and PhD from in social geography from University of Copenhagen, and he is currently a professor emeritus at the School of Agrarian and Labour Studies, SOAS, University of London. He has dedicated his academic career to understanding the complexities of agrarian transformation, caste and class relations, and labor dynamics in India. With over 3 decades of research experience, including extensive field work in northern India, especially in Uttar Pradesh, and visits across other regions of India, Professor Lerche has been at the forefront of the debates on agrarian change, on free labor, and rural migration. His work particularly notable for framing the issues not only in issues not as isolated phenomena, but deeply interconnected processes shaped by broader economic and social dynamics. The concept of conjugated oppression, along with developed with along with Alpa Shah, is an especially a significant contribution, offering a nuanced understanding of the intersections of caste, class, gender, and labor under contemporary neoliberal capitalism. As the long-serving editor of the prestigious Journal of Agrarian Change, Professor Lerche has played a pivotal role in framing the critical debates on agrarian crisis and transition. His publications, there are various publications which I'm not going to list out. We can find them easily online. Especially the recent work, the book he published along with Alpa Shah and others, Ground Down by Growth, Tribe, Caste, Class, and Inequality in 21st Century India. And influential articles on caste, class dynamics, social mobilization, agrarian crisis continue to shape the scholarship in the field. On a personal note, uh, it's deeply honor and privilege to me to meet Professor Lerche in person, because when I started my own work in PhD in 2013 and 14, there was a special issue in the Journal of Agrarian Change uh, uh, on agrarian transition and left politics in India. He, along with Professor Barbara Harris-White and Alpa Shah, edited that special issue, which kind of reframed the debate on agrarian question, agrarian transition, the questions of Maoist politics in Indian context. So that work has kind of gave me a theoretical and empirical grounding to start my own PhD. So his work is very instrumental in kind of shaping my own understanding of the complexities of rural and agrarian societies in Indian context. So in that sense, it's a deeply a personal moment and honor to meet Professor Lerche. Okay, and we are also organizing this lecture in association with the Indian Sociological Society, and there's a research committee on agrarian and rural studies. This committee was there in the earlier period, but that committee was kind of we don't know, for some reason, people thought that agrarian is no longer interesting, rural is no longer interesting, what we need to study urban and all. So that committee was discontinued. So we, along with Professor Maitreyi Chowdhury, who is the current president of Indian Sociological Society, we again reinstated the committee on research committee on agrarian and rural studies. And when we reinstated the committee last year, we wanted to start the committee with Professor Lerche's lecture, because his work is more contemporary, more grounded, more empirical, and he also engages with theoretical questions, mixing with empirical realities. So we couldn't start off with the inaugural lecture with his for various reasons. So, but now I think it's a privilege and honor to have him on this in our campus and on the platform of Indian Sociological Society. So, without any further ado, I think I'll welcome Professor Lerche to share his lecture with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Director Chandrasekhar, co-organizers, and of course also the Indian Sociological Society's Research Committee on Rural and Agrarian Studies, which I very much welcome, and I'm excited that it's back up and running. It'll be interesting to see what you can do. it's a pleasure to be here, of course, at GITAM, but also and also to be among scholars that for some reason feel inspired by some of my work. It's also a daunting introduction because I have to live up to that now. I will do my best, of course, and we will see. So I've called my talk Complexities of Rural and Agrarian Life in India because that is what rural and agrarian life is, and it relates to a number of aspects that I've outlined here. And I'll take that further and look into both the empirical aspects of rural and agrarian life through data sets, but also through case studies that I have conducted or been party to conducting over the years. I started my work in India in earnest back in '93, working in 2 villages in Uttar Pradesh, and I've been returning to them ever since. So that is one aspect of what I'll draw on there, plus studies together with Al-Pasha and others. I'll first sort of go through that. I'll draw some conclusions because I think this material shows a need to rethink various aspects of the way one normally looks at agrarian change in India and beyond. And I will look specifically into the theoretical implications. And I'll take that further than most would do, maybe, because I will, in the last part of the lecture, will relate that to racial capitalism, so way beyond India, because I think there's a point in thinking of class and caste not as an isolated phenomenon in India. Of course, empirically it is here, but to understand it analytically, I think one has to go beyond India. So that, in short, is what I will be doing. And I'll start up with framing it within classic thinking about agrarian change. I've got time there. Okay. Okay. So, so the classic framing of the rule is really around agrarian transition and structural transformation. That is both in classic development economics, so before neoliberalism, that kind of classic development economics, and also within Marxist political economy. The idea that societies would move forward, would develop through a structural transformation that involved a move from pre-capitalist agriculture to capitalism in agriculture, and to and through that the creation of a surplus that could be siphoned off and invested in industry. So industrial development could be created through initially transformation within agriculture. So that is the structural transformation or the agrarian transition that's what was common parlance within that kind of thinking, and that it would lead to eventually both economic growth but also prosperity for all. That was the intention by the ones that promoted this. So the starting point would be accumulation in agriculture. Hence, the absence of strong accumulation in agriculture is a classic problem within this kind of thinking. And its transformation from pre-capitalist societies to capitalist societies. And there's a belief in this, that this will create a dynamic national capitalist development. And the main difference between the classic mainstream thinking and classic Marxist thinking was really that for Marxists, it was the class struggle that would drive this, while that was not part of the mainstream thinking. But in many ways, there were parallels in this kind of agreements, in this kind of looking at development. Now, I argue against this. And let me just say, the photos you see here, by far, most of them are photos I've taken during my field works in India. I've probably spent 3 years in the field in different parts of India over my time. And a few of them are stock images, but I think it's fairly clear when it is stock images. Now, So I think that kind of understanding doesn't work well any longer, because actually I think the idea of a transition from pre-capitalism to capitalism, those days are gone. Pre-capitalism doesn't exist any longer. Global capitalism dominates across the board. There is no social classes today that are reproduced solely outside of capitalism, which is the classic idea of pre-capitalism, that societies can continue outside of capitalism. That is just not possible anymore. I'm not the only one arguing that. Sort of within agrarian transition literature, it goes back to Bernstein, Henry Bernstein in the 1980s, putting that argument forward. So it's a classic argument. I'm putting it forward too. I'm sort of pushing it a bit, again, in line with Henry Bernstein, by saying that this means the idea of development involving a transition, capitalist development in agriculture, siphoning off into industry, etc., that's been and gone too. That has been bypassed. We have capitalism without having had that agrarian transition. And that is the case in many countries, and it's certainly the case in India, in my view. Now, what does that kind of capitalism look like? Well, it doesn't look quite like the old thinkers had hoped. It is neoliberal capitalism, and it means we haven't seen national development. We haven't seen prosperity for all. We have a capitalism that doesn't involve those nice aspects. It is nevertheless capitalism. In fact, in my view, it was only a fairly brief intermezzo where we had social welfare regimes that created welfare for all in certain parts of the world. Before that, in Europe, in England, etc., capitalism was brutal, and it was only through struggles for welfare regimes that was achieved. And also only because a sizable part of the proportion could migrate. So poor people could bugger off, and therefore there were fewer people that had to be taken care of. And that is important too. In Sweden, it was like a third of the population that migrated between a quarter and a third of the population that migrated between 1850 and 1930, I think it was. So these are sizable chunks of the population that could migrate. So the kind of capitalism that developed was in the north, the west, were based both on imperial plunder, but also on sending off people. So welfare was possible in a way that maybe is harder today in the global south. So in spite of that, or maybe because of that, the idea of structural transformation is a core issue for many people. I understand that. I mean, if this could happen, that kind of development could happen, it would be great. And so, for example, the most recent India Employment Report, 2024, is about structural transformation. So the classic ideas are alive and kicking. I see less hope in that direction. And of course, such a view has significant implications. And this lecture is, among other things, about those applications or implications. But let us first just throw a bit of data at you. Here we have the share in employment of agriculture, services, and industry, and we can see while agriculture employment is going down, except towards the end, it is not mainly manufacturing that is going up. In fact, we'll just have to skip ahead. Here we can see the dotted flat line is manufacturing. Manufacturing is stagnant when it comes to employment. The reason why industry goes up here is because industry involves construction as well, and that is it is construction and services that people move to when they moved out of agriculture. So this is not a classic agrarian transition. You would expect high growth in manufacturing employment, and also in gross value added, and that is flat around it's somewhere in the 20s. Of course, you can see the twist at the end, and I'll return to that. In fact, you could say the transition, if there ever was one, has gone into reverse since COVID, which is maybe also why the transition issue has returned, because many people are alarmed over that people are, that actually there aren't any jobs, or there aren't enough jobs anymore outside of agriculture to keep people outside of agriculture. They're returning to agriculture. Now, so what we're seeing is, to repeat, that there hasn't been an increase in manufacturing employment, that at the same time, growth outside agriculture, by no means can one see the enormous growth that India has experienced in the last 30 years as a case of all of a sudden the agricultural surplus being there, being invested. No, this is based mainly on global capital and on trading capital, not on agricultural capital. And something I'm saying, but it's also something that many others are saying, including Tamoraman in his excellent book that summarizes the existing literature on this issue. And we're seeing not only this problem, but actually we've seen employment outside of agriculture growing very slowly and now falling. And the kind of employment out there, as is well known, is not good employment. It is not decent work. 90% of the working population work in informal labor relations or as self-employed, in spite of the fall in agricultural employment, because that is, of course, that is always informal employment. But when they leave that, they get into other types of informal employment. And just to continue the misery, the wages have actually been stagnant for the last 10 years. They did increase in the early part of the 2000s, but they've been stagnant in broad terms since then. And India now has the dubious record of being one of the most unequal societies in the world, according to the World Inequalities Report. So that is just, in a sense, contextualizing. If we then move to agriculture, now it is classic to say Indian agriculture is in crisis. Let me just start by saying, well, it's not, if you look at it by way of production. It is, the growth rates are actually quite good. They're not good enough, but they are just around 3%, which is what they've been more or less forever. They've been above now and then, they've been below now and then. 2.8 is not particularly bad for agriculture as an economic sector. And to me, this has also got to do with that there is a consistent investment in agriculture by by farmers and others. This is capitalist agriculture where the owners of the land invest as much as they can. They try to accumulate. They are not reproduced, or they produce for sale. They are not reproduced outside of capitalism. That said, of course, people in the countryside are in crisis. So, but that is not agriculture as a sector, as an economic sector. There's a crisis in particular for agricultural income. And that's again important because it's not for incomes of all rural people. And it's not for all kind of incomes. Now, when we take the most recent data I could find on income growth for average agricultural households, they are from Ramakumar's recent piece in Agrarian, what's it called? Review of Agrarian Studies. He shows that the average households, if we're looking at the period, the most recent period, their income from cultivation has fallen, but their income from outside of agriculture by way of wages have actually increased quite dramatically because they do more work out there, because we just saw wages haven't increased, but they do more work out there. So in total, they are better off up until before COVID at least. And that is because of mainly of this and also because of husbandry. But cultivation is a problem. Now, so let's just hammer this in. Wages are now more important numerically than cultivating crops for the average farmer. We are clearly talking about a partial move out of agriculture for farmers. It will vary, etc., but it is a clear partial move. They're still farmers, They haven't left agriculture, we saw that, but they have moved out partially. Now, of course, that would be fine if there were lots of jobs out there. But we also saw that informalized non-agricultural work outside of agriculture is stagnating at best now. So even the kind of sort of mainstream idea of capitalist development from agriculture to industry actually create a crisis for the rural population. It's not a crisis in agriculture per se that creates that. It's that this can't happen. This continued development out of agriculture can't happen. That is the main problem in a sense. Okay, if we dig deeper, then within agriculture, there are also differences. There are crises for some, not for all. I mean, it's well known that sort of the standard figure, the big data set shows us is that small and marginal farmers constitute nearly an excessive amount of farmers. By far, most farmers are that small. And whereas the medium and large farmers it's only 4.3%. They still are in charge of nearly between a quarter and a third of all the operated area. And we also know that that figure is too low because there are land ceilings, you have to hide how much land you own, etc. So any case study will show that the actual amount of big farmers and land they own is bigger than this. But even these official figures shows that it is likely that some people will do well and others will not do so well. Now, it's not just sort of random. We also, of course, know that this is structured by caste. That Dalits are overwhelmingly the landless or the extremely small and marginal farmers. Some OBCs are as well, but OBCs is a tricky category because some of them are big farmers and others are absolutely not so. But we know for Dalits that is the case. We also know that Adivasis, even though they tend to own land, they will not have the capital to invest, and therefore they don't get much out of that land. We also know that there's another sort of classic take on the problems within the countryside is that the women's workforce participation ratio has fallen dramatically. So that is one issue. Another issue is the claim that agriculture is becoming feminized. Now, let us take both of them. It's clear that official figures showed that up till recently, the women's workforce, the rural labor force participation ratio did fall. It's also clear it's increased quite dramatically over the last few years. Now, is that real, or is it just that enumerators now actually look out for this? Of course, I can't say for sure, but when I discuss with colleagues, and when I read, for example, the recent India labor reports that I mentioned earlier, the argument is that at least in part it is real, because what happened with COVID when people were kicked out of the country of informalized labor, had to migrate home, women had to return very directly to whatever they could do to help maintain the families. And that meant that for small farmers, they went from doing mainly unregistered and often reproductive work to also become much more directly involved in productive work. They were already, but they became more involved enough so that they now are to a larger extent registered, especially for unpaid work within the family. So that is, according to that report I just mentioned, that is the main reason for the increase in women's workforce participation. Is that good or bad? It's certainly intriguing. It is not that they've got good jobs all of a sudden. Now, but clear gendered changes here. Of course, there's always the problem. So far, I've talked about India. Now, so coming from Europe, India is like a continent, and to say things about India without acknowledging the extreme regional differences in India is just pure nonsense. And here's just one aspect of that. If we're looking at it within agriculture, then it was calculated back in 2011 that in Punjab, the income per acre was 8 times higher than the income per acre in Maharashtra and 3.6 times higher than in Karnataka. Now, that is quite significant. So if you're a farmer in Punjab, you are much more likely to not suffer, particularly if you're one of the big farmers, than if you're a farmer in some of these states. So that one will always have to, I'm just flagging it. I haven't got the space to go into regional differences, but we should be aware of that is the case. Okay. Now, so I've acknowledged, pointed out that the main income or that a significant income of people that have land or operate land is really outside of agriculture. So let's look at what people do outside of agriculture. Now, again, this is clearly structured. One can look at just again the data sets if one wants to look at the kind of jobs where regular workers, casual laborer, self-employed, or one can look at the case studies. It all shows that general caste people tend to have a much higher proportion working in as more or less, what if they're rural, more or less permanent migrant laborers as regular laborers, i.e. working in white-collar jobs, or in what, if I speak to people in the villages in UP, we'll call private nokri. So this is service, but in the private sector. So separate from them, there are the seasonal migrants that go for 6 months, 9 months, etc. Now, there's no good government of India data on this, but the standard guesstimate is that we're talking between 60 and 100 million people. So there is enormous variations here, but it's very clear, and certainly even government institutions put sticks their neck out on this. Dalits and Adivasis are overrepresented among seasonal migrant workers, and one estimate is around 40% will be Dalits and Adivasis. What they do is also well known, is what UNESCO called dirty, dangerous, and degrading jobs that local people do not want to do, at least not for the wage that migrants are offered. So it's a hyper precarious job, the lowest wages, the longest working hours, often tied to labor contractors, with whatever that means, jobs we're talking about here. Dalits and Adivasis dominate within the agricultural labor sector. They dominate within brick kilns. They are overrepresented within construction and manual transport. They are also overrepresented within low-end manufacturing job and low-end servicing jobs. But so the sectors where they really, this is where they go, because there are no other jobs. And then there's slightly better ones, which is the low-end manufacturing and low-end service jobs. When they work, there's also plenty of evidence, there's plenty of stigmatization, both as Dalits, Adivasis, and as migrants. I mean, overall, they are second-class citizens. That is, again, the studies abound showing that as migrant, you have little access to welfare, you have little access to housing, schools, hospitals, programs. Of course, you have no voting rights also to local municipalities where you work. So therefore, local politicians don't consider you particularly important. And you can be harassed any day because you haven't got documents that show that you belong here. So it is not particularly fun to be migrant worker. So quite similar to international migrant workers that haven't got documents really. So even though it's within India, they have documents or they are Indian citizens, they lose a lot of rights when they migrate. Of course, labor rights is practically also non-existent. In a sense, it's not formal non-existent, but everyone knows that if you're migrant labor and try to organize, you most probably get kicked out very quickly, and you cannot expect much solidarity from local workers who often perceive you as having taken their jobs. So the conclusion that here, that Dalits, Adivasis, and migrant labor are consistently at the bottom of social and economic hierarchies, I think is obvious. Rural class and caste relations in a sense, through this, are being reproduced from the countryside now in the modern economy along the same dividing line as existed in the countryside. Okay, so if we take a step back from this and say, so what does this mean? What is ruralities today then? Well, clearly, the dichotomy rural-urban, well, it might still be there, but it's not the same as before. People move between, they work between, etc., at different levels. It is also clear that integration, cross-cutting integration, is caste and class specific. It is also gender specific. It is, to put it differently, moving out of agriculture in this way really solidifies the existing caste and class relations. It also changes them, of course. Nothing stays the same. But what is solidified is power relations, who is in charge, who is not, oppression and discrimination. It is changing, as I'll show, but it is maintained. And I mean, so in the olden days, you have the palace for the landlords and the shacks for the Dalits. Now the farmers have cars and machinery, and the Dalits often have don't live in shacks anymore. So that changes, but the structural relation is the same. Okay, now when we come to this, going from the big picture, what we don't get from the big picture data sets is causal relations. They cannot show that. They can show there's this and there's that, but how does it relate? To investigate that, one needs to look at case studies, look at the qualitative information. So here I have two case studies which I'll touch upon very briefly because there isn't much time. But one is from my long-lasting field work in Uttar Pradesh, in Jaunpur and Muzaffarnagar districts. So where in both cases a dominant farming caste and a big Jata Dalit community in Muzaffarnagar district, sugarcane growing pictures from there. It's of course Jats and Jatas in Jaunpur. It is Thakus and Dalits. And the findings here are not unique. I mean, the foundation for agrarian studies, all their village surveys shows in broad terms the same. They would not always interpret it in quite the way I do, but the findings is in broad terms the same. So just a couple of data sets here. You might already have looked at them. Unsurprisingly, the farming caste owns the land. Where Dalits have land, such as in Jaunpur, because for a number of reasons, they have very, very little. And unsurprisingly, who owns the cars? It is. I mean, this follows what one would expect. Now, going deeper into it, looking at the occupational differences, because one thing is agriculture, but I've just argued it matters also what goes on outside of agriculture. Now, so if we're looking at jobs in addition to for the landowning caste, and often as the only jobs for the Jatas, I have classified jobs into good jobs, okay jobs, low-end jobs. And good jobs are jobs where you earn more than 20,000 back in 2016-17. So that means it's white-collar jobs, it is skilled workers, it is government jobs, it's professional jobs, it's running a big business, a good business. So happened, Jats and Thakus are all, apart from one or two, and that it is a widower, in those kind of jobs. Jatas are in low-end jobs and some in okay jobs. Low-end jobs are jobs where you earn less than 10,000, so roughly speaking here. So that's construction, agricultural labor, brick kilns, those sorts. Okay jobs are if you're semi-skilled. Working as a semi-skilled in formalized labor in the automotive industry, for example. And while originally people migrated from these areas already in the 90s, and now actually there are slightly fewer people that migrate because there are more construction jobs locally. So of course, if you don't have to migrate, you don't. But it's jobs outside of the village for all of them. Now, these pictures are from the Tacos. Now, if we're looking at what happens to the landed groups, they are doing very well. The Tacos have become, in particular, astronomically rich. They managed to tie into, through Taco networks in Mumbai, into the construction industry and make a killing. Many of them, most of the households have built rural palaces. The family here are a family that has built a local school, secondary school, and ITI, a certificate school, and they spent 8 crores on that. These people are moneyed. Their sons and daughters are professionals. Now, unsurprisingly, agriculture has a low priority. They tend to lease out their land. They can't make enough money on agriculture. And this is actually quite common across Eastern UP from other studies, that Tacos have managed to integrate themselves so much in the modern economy at a very high level that agriculture doesn't matter much for them. The Jats in Muzaffarnagar, the Jats is an old farming caste. They have done well. They've always had access to jobs in the army. They, in a sense, have had reservations to the army because of the Jat regiments, so it's been quite easy to go in there. So over time, they have managed to accumulate and invest. But for them, agriculture is about going on 2 legs, modernized agriculture as well as the jobs outside. But they're all doing very well. The Jatas are also slightly less badly off than before, but inequalities has increased quite dramatically. Now, I won't go into detail with this, but I think it's fairly clear in variations, depending on whether you've got lands or not, that a proportion of the men still work in agriculture. This is seasonal. This is when they're not working in the migration job. Then they come back and work in agriculture. Some have lands, etc. Very few work in good jobs, as you can see when you go down the list. Now, and their conditions, in some ways, when I ask them how they are, they say, "Oh, the Tacos leave them alone by and large now. I mean, you have less oppression, less rape, less beating up, and so on. So they feel better off in that sense. But they still have, as is the case across India, the educational premium. What you need to get a job by way of education. If you're Dalits and Adivasis, you need better education to get the same kind of jobs as those of the other caste. So there's clear discrimination taking place, not only in how to get the education, but also in what you can get for the education. Women are the main agricultural laborers and farmers among the Dalits. They are here. So the men migrate, the women stay back home by and large. And what do? They pick up any jobs that they can to survive. So that is what this shows here. And by the way, the work participation ratio is like 2-3 times as high as the official figures. So clearly, well, in these villages, the official figures are not borne out. They work practically only in the village, and one has to acknowledge that we are talking about a patriarchy that means that women cannot work freely elsewhere. They can only work where they're protected, which is back in the village. Okay, so that's first case study. The second case study, let's draw on the work that I've done together with Alpashar and 5 postdocs, Dalit Ben Babali, who worked in Telangana, Jaisalan Raj, who worked in the tea plantations in Kerala, Vikram Thakur, who worked in the hills near Namara Dam, Brendan Donegan, who worked in the industrial belt in Tamil Nadu, and Richard Axelby, that worked in the Himalayan valleys of Champa and spent a year there, looked at Dalits and Adivasis, their work condition, migration. And the picture was stunningly clear. We were surprised that this was the case, that across the board, Adivasis were joining as migrant laborers, always at the lowest end, very often kicking out Dalits from the local Dalits from the jobs they had before, be it in the factories, be it in the tea plantations, very different kinds of industries. The same thing happened. So a significant local for the local workers, seasonal migration was experienced as a significant phenomenon, detrimental to them if they weren't the migrants themselves. Often they were introduced to break strikes. If the local Dalits dared to go on strike, what do? You get in informalized Dalit laborers. That happened well in two or three of these locations. So what was established was a hierarchy where Adivasi migrant workers were at the bottom, then Dalits, and then of course all other workers that were in better jobs. And I will not go into more details really, just show you some nice pictures here from the tea plantations where this happened, where Adivasis got in on worse conditions than Dalits and made it possible for the plantation owners to stop hiring Dalit workers as permanent laborers. There's the whole brick kiln construction sector industry where Adivasis also join and Dalit joins, and where if you belong to those groups, you will never become more than a helper. You will never become skilled. Again, of course, the odd one, but that is the standard picture. And within manufacturing, where Dalits will always do the dirty work, the stigmatized work, and the most informalized work, that Dalits and Adivasis. Now, if one wants to think about this, then what is actually happening? Well, migrants can do this work for a very low wage because the rest of the family is taken care of back home. They were also taken care of when they were children, and they know when they're worn out, they can go back and retire, and there will be a way of surviving back home. If they fall ill, they travel back home. Their whole reproduction really takes place back home. Now, so you don't, as an employer, you don't have to pay migrant workers enough for them to reproduce themselves and their family. You can pay them less, whereas classically you pay a worker so that at least the worker can keep on working. Now that you don't need to do here. So the way Alpa and I conceptualized was that what we're seeing is really that migrant workers are not only second-class citizens, they're also super exploited. Because the cost of invisible care, economy, and social reproduction is taken care of elsewhere. So there's a relation between working within agriculture and outside agriculture, but it is not one where necessarily, it is one where it is closely where your position at the bottom is being supported through that relation. And we're not talking small fry here. If we're talking about how many people that are part of seasonal migration, in the sense of either staying in the village while some members migrate or migrating, if we just say 4 individuals per household, and that is conservative, then we're talking 4 times the numbers before, so 260 to 400 million people are involved in this. So it's a big phenomenon. Okay. Let's take another step back and conceptualize this a bit. Now, I made the argument that the agrarian transition have been bypassed, that rural life is very complex, there's less of a rural-urban divide, there's a significant but not full move out of agriculture, that women are stuck in the villages, that there is a structured change that relates to class and to caste, or that this is structured both by class, caste, tribe, and gender, and that India is as a social formation is fully capitalist, including the countryside. Now, when this is analyzed, most people will start talking about the peasantry. Now, the peasantry is actually a category that emerged as representing pre-capitalist farmers. Now, the problem with that category is that it sort of clubs everything together. You are on the countryside, you're a peasant, and it doesn't explain anything. I much prefer the category petty commodity producers because it is precise. Petty commodity producers says you are a producer, you have capital, i.e. land, and you have labor. You are a complex and contradictory unit of land and labor. You're not a capitalist where others work for you. You have a bit of capital, but you have to put in yourself, your own labor for you to work. Now, that is the term I use for what others would call peasants. So that is the first conceptual issue. Good to be precise, because if you lose your land, then you're no longer a peasant. If you get a lot more land, other people work for you, you become a capitalist. Now, but that in itself isn't enough. We need to get away from thinking analytically about people in the countryside as only belonging to agriculture. Obviously, they don't. So we need a way of analyzing classes that goes beyond that. The peasant category doesn't. These are agriculturalists. So we have to be able to have categories where which encompasses that people are peasants one day, workers the next, and the next season they might be self-employed outside of agriculture. Yeah, I'm back online. Good. We need a category that can cover these complexities we have that clearly exist. And that do not focus on one sector only. And to me, the only reasonable category I've come across is classes of labor. The idea that we look at society as divided between capital and those that are exploited, or at least do not exploit others, and work across different sectors. They are classes of labor because they live predominantly off their own labor. Some of them might have a bit of capital, some of them might be petty commodity producers, but they will live predominantly off their own labor. So it's a broad category that distinguishes between that and capital. And that reflects, in my view, the complexities that we are actually experiencing. It also reflects who people can ally with, I think, in principle, because these are people who in the long term are in the same economic situation. To put it more precisely, so the classes of labor are the groups that can engage in simple reproduction only. They can manage to reproduce themselves. They can manage to survive at the level they are, but they cannot engage in extended reproduction. They cannot accumulate and move from simple reproduction to capital accumulation. So there's another way of putting the same, that those who are only engaged in simple reproduction belongs to the classes of labor. And that kind of reproduction is primarily, as I've written here, this is a quote from Henry Bernstein, who is also the source of this category: reproduction through insecure and oppressive wage employment and/or precarious small-scale and insecure survival activities. That is the category we're looking at. And I think that has helped me and a number of other scholars in getting out of that focus on agrarian relation as the only thing that matters for class relation, but also of understanding that it matters what sort of work you have outside of agriculture. It is not all the same. So that to me is an excellent start, but it's only a start, because what happened to caste here? It disappeared. Now we have to think of how can caste fit into, or does caste fit into a class relation, or how do we think about caste in relation to what we're talking about here? Now, so just to take one step back to sort of the empirical facts. I mean, we know what happened with caste. We know that the classic patron-client relations in the countryside has broken down. We know that purity pollution-based discrimination is much less today than it used to be, teacups, wells, etc. But what we also see is that discrimination continues in with regards to which jobs you get, what education you can get, and how you're treated, whether you're still stigmatized because you belong to the wrong group, whether you don't dare to give your caste name if you have a good job, etc., etc. So we know it exists, but it's less religious symbolism than what we used to see in the society. And that fits very well, I think, with the kind of stratified labor market that exists in India today. It's based on power. It is not based primarily on purity pollution. And therefore caste and tribe is a good, it has, these categories and the way they're treated have developed into something that can help stratify society. So in short, caste discrimination has changed dramatically over time. The discourse has also changed, as Wagmore says. What can be said has changed. You can't openly be discriminatory and derogative in your comments anymore. You might be it with your friends, but you can't just stand up and behave like that. But there's still plenty of oppression against Dalit assertions back in the village, of course. We're not talking about a harmonious society. Just because there's no patron-client relations, there's still lots of oppression whenever Dalits try to assert themselves. And so in my view and in the view of, this is work based on Alpacias and my work, we see that we argue that racialized and caste tribe-based discrimination has mutated, has changed, while the structural discrimination has been maintained. Now, as I promised, I wanted to go beyond India. Now, because I think what we're seeing here is really India becoming, in this sense, very much like most other capitalist countries. Because wherever you go, you have discrimination. Wherever all countries, you can, where there's a proper numerical statistical service, will be able to show how groups of other ethnic groups, immigrants, will be worse off by and large than the local people. There are outliers. For example, the Indian group in the US is doing better than the white group. So there are outliers, but as a general pattern, it is clear. And I put some of the data up here. I'm not going to repeat them go into them in detail, but it's clear that when it comes to access to good work and having to be content with bad work, income levels, there are significant differences. And as several authors point out, that when you crunch the numbers, what you cannot attribute this simply to lower skills or different wrong education or so on. There's a residual that can only be explained as outright discrimination across the board. And again, I'm not going into this, but that is very clear. So the big question then is this something that will disappear? Because if it will disappear, in a sense, we don't have to take it too seriously. It will go away. Now, and that is, of course, what modernization theory and Nehruvian ideology and also much Marxism have claimed. It will disappear. Economic development will do away with what was seen as pre-capitalist social oppression and discrimination, including racism, including casteism. As we modernize, it'll go. Now, in my view, it won't. And here, I just to throw various sort of supporting views in here. Thomas Piketty, in a wonderful book, 900 pages, Capital and Ideology, shows, among other things, that in the global West, in the global North, since the beginning of neoliberalism, identities have been used to create an alliance between big capital groups and white male workers, allowing for the lowering of the proportionate lowering of wages of other social groups in America, in Europe. In America, it's along race lines. In Europe, it's mainly along migration and religion. But the system is the same. A system has been created where there are the insiders, the white males, and the others that are discriminated against. And he has some he's a number cruncher. He has some wonderful figures showing that is indeed the case. So we're seeing a reinforcement of identitarian cleavages since the beginning of neoliberalism, according to Thomas Piketty. And he's not the only one that says this. So, I mean, he says this not very theoretically, but with lots of data. More theoretical scholars like the sociologist Stuart Hall has been very clear, a Caribbean scholar based at the LSE while he was alive, that the cultural specific character of the labor force is central to capitalism, according to him. That capitalism could not survive without being able to divide and rule and distinguish between different groups that could be given more or less income, better jobs, etc., etc. So what he calls the capitalism requires differentiated forms of exploitation. And the same, of course, is the case for gender relations. I'll take one step further back, and I am aware I've got 10 minutes or so left because we started late. So, so some people go further than this. They argue that what we're talking about really is racial capitalism, that this is constant across capitalism, that the exploitation and oppression along the lines of race has always been central. Cedric Robinson's work, Black Marxism, it's another 700-pager, is absolutely central to this. But other scholars before him, Black American scholars such as W.B. Du Bois and Oliver Cromwell Cox have also been on about this. And they argue that even before capitalism, there were in Europe racial discrimination. And when capitalism was born, it took that and used that to create the difference that was necessary for it. Now, why is it necessary? Well, there's certainly one thing that's necessary, and that is capitalism promises us all freedom and equality. If at the same time you treat certain group of people much worse than others, it's not so easy to argue that point. So you need to argue that they are not quite real humans or not quite citizens like us. Only then can they be treated differently. So you need that, so ideologically, you need that difference. However, some people go further than that. Charlie Post, an American Marxist, argue that it's directly linked to the capitalist economic processes, that without difference, you could not have sectors that were less developed than others and therefore had to rely more on a labor force, whereas the most developed sectors with high technology can pay a bit more. You need something that enables the differentiation of wages necessary for accumulation across the board. So central to capitalism's survival itself, according to him, central to the political economy of capitalism, racism is central for that. And to put it in different terms, which is commonly used here, is racism is part of the economic base. It is not just superstructure. Race changed over time, but the argument is it is always there. It is built into capitalism that it exists. Going back to India, let me start by saying I'm not saying that race and caste is the same. Caste has its own history, as has race. But what I'm saying is that the way, and this is a view that I've developed together with Al-Bashar, is that race and caste holds the same position on the capitalism. Capitalism makes use of it in the same purposes. So we talk about racial capitalism, that capitalism shapes and changes race, ethnicity, religion, caste, gender, sexuality, etc., so that it can be used for discrimination and difference. And the argument here is that we ought to understand caste as it is used by capitalism in the same way as racism. What is the alternative? Well, it is either to go back to saying India is so specific, like the Dumontian Homo hierarchicus, so it is built into the Indian psyche that there will always be race difference, or to say that this is pre-capitalist. and that therefore there has to be a change, as capitalism develop, it'll disappear. That's really the two other chances there are, and in our view, it is much better to see it as a part of modern capitalism, which is why we use the term conjugated oppression. Oppression and exploitation goes together in a cocktail that is much worse than its elements. So I'm aware the organizer starts to twitch. I've been on for too long, so let me not repeat any of the empirical findings, but just say that if we're looking at the overall argument, then the overall argument is that India is capitalist, that it is a kind of capitalism of the global south, that the kind of transition that happened in the global north has not happened here. The agrarian transition has been bypassed here. And it's not only in India, it is quite common across the global south. Of course, unless you are the world's factory in China, where it's a different story. But, and that leads to very complex rural-urban classes of labor, not to a strong proletariat. So capitalism in India, on top of that, is, in my view, racial capitalism. All capitalism is. And therefore, caste, tribe, etc., must form part not only of a superstructure analysis, but directly of analysis of class relations. And with that, I thank you for your patience and for staying awake. Okay. Well, it's one of the beauties of question and answer sessions is that it is possible to ask questions about anything. It is harder to answer questions about everything. But let me try nevertheless on the Bangladesh issue. It is it is all Bangladeshis. People self-register their ethnic identity if they want to in the UK, so it's quite easy to make these comparisons. And it is not based on first, second, third generation. It is simply that if you take the group per se, they are worse off than other groups. And then one can go into why, and that's very interesting, but it's maybe not the place to do so. Now, India and elsewhere, it's not, I don't really use India to explain elsewhere. If I do anything, I use elsewhere to explain what's going on in India. So the grand global capitalism, racial capitalism, I'm trying to say that is actually relevant for the Indian situation as well. But you ask specifically about Africa. Now, and this is where I sometimes you should just say I shouldn't answer this. It's certainly the case in Southern Africa. There are of course ethnic differences across Africa with different where ethnicity and class are interrelated. But I would not dare to go further than that. I will leave that to my good colleagues working on Africa. It is. What I do here is unsurprisingly generalize, and I will stand with that generalization. When you look at the general figures, Dalits are worse off. General figures are that Dalits are in the worst jobs. General figures are that Dalits are more likely than any other group to be landless. So the general figures, the general trend stands. When there's a general trend, there are also always, nearly always, other trends. I mean, reservations, of course, have mattered for a group of Dalits. It has not mattered enough to make up for that. I mean, it has not dragged the Dalits out of being the poorest group. But of course, it has mattered. There are also, I mean, if I just come from Maharashtra, where the Mahas history is quite different from other groups, being part of the British Army, the colonial army, having land early on, Ambedkar being there. So the emancipatory and economic trajectory is quite different from many other caste groups. Still, in spite of that, I would maintain that Dalits are always discriminated. They are also, as a tendency, always in the worst jobs. I examined the PhD from well on Delhi a few years ago, two Dalit communities in Delhi that showed how, I mean, one was Valmiki doing well in the sense that they had government jobs. So economically well off, but also always discriminated against, as well as the Jathas, that was the other group, had to hide their caste name when the few of them that succeeded in getting good jobs outside, because otherwise they couldn't progress. I mean, that is probably the ultimate discrimination. You have to hide who you are. It's so to come to your question, in my own field areas, no, it's been I won't bring it up again, but the figures that showed jobs showed that there were one or two or three in good jobs. So absolutely minuscule in these villages of those that had experienced proper social improvement. But yeah, of course they exist. It's they will have to exist. I mean, it's there are systems in place that allows a small group to improve their conditions. So of course they work. To me, one should still analyze them within conjugated oppression. One should analyze the cases become more complex. I mean, complexities, because we have cases then where people, even if they are not exploited any longer, probably still experience stigmatization along caste lines. So then it becomes even more complex, the picture. But that is all I can say. I can't talk to the particular case. It's I can tell you that we published an article in Journal of Agrarian Change from Haryana a couple of years ago that showed the appalling conditions of a particular Dalit rural community. So it's not across the board certainly that Dalits are doing well in Haryana. That you will have to, certainly not according to that also. But yeah. 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 No, a very interesting question. And it's anything can happen. I mean, this is a crystal ball. I haven't got that. But if I should nevertheless say something, I think when one is looking at migration today, some of it is, I mean, skill-based. What does that mean? I mean, it can mean many different things. I mean, indeed, to get a good job, you have to have skill and probably a certificate, etc. Even the top end of Dalits will need their ITI certificate in order to get a job. For example, in the automotive industry in Delhi, from the Jaunpur village, the big thing is to get the technical certificate, so you can turn up around Delhi and get a semi-skilled job in the automotive industry for 9 months a year. That is the best you can do, really. So skill matters. Access to skill today, I mean, again, it's a global issue. I mean, due to historical differences, historical discrimination, there's not equal access to education and to skills, and therefore there will be a difference in who gets the good skills and who don't. Unless there's an enormous effort to change that, then that will be the case. When it comes to the countryside, the first big issue is, of course, who owns the land. I mean, imagine a land reform where the present farming castes had their land parceled out so that Dalits got land. Now that will certainly change the countryside. It will also be very conflictual because they don't want to give up their land. So, but if one were to think of a third way, I think an immediate third way would be thinking along those lines. I mean, because that is one of the biggest differences, biggest divides. That is access to the means of survival. Agriculture is getting more skilled. It's a mixture these days. I mean, you need tractor drivers in the Punjab. You need combine harvest drivers. You need mechanics to make sure that the irrigation works. You need insight into spraying. Well, some people spray without insights, and that is not good for them. But you do need insight into it. You need skills. It's again the tricky part is who gets those skills. Very often the drivers of the big machinery are not Dalits. I mean, it's a bit like the history that we all know about gender relations. Whenever there's a new technology and therefore a job is upgraded that used to be done by women, men take over. It's a bit the same as far as I can see. And I can't claim the kind of evidence on this as I have on some other things. But it does appear to me that happens when it comes to caste as well, that the good jobs, therefore, with technology goes to others. So, but it is, I mean, unless something happens that all of a sudden new jobs, good jobs become a growth industry in India. Unless that happens, there has to be better conditions for people to survive in a reasonable manner in the countryside. That is the only other way out. So some sort of way to enable that has to be thought of much more seriously, and if it is to be at least in a sort of social democratic way, providing welfare to everyone, something has to happen to the way the caste relation separates who gets the good jobs. So that's all I can say. That is, I'll answer the last one first, and I'll say it's actually quite difficult to have a radical imagining these days. I think when the global warming is upon us, and it's hard to think of what will happen in the foreseeable future. So to think radical really starts to come to think survival. So I have maybe personally, I think that there are issues of how radical one can actually be these days, because what we're facing is so extraordinary. I also think it's much trickier than it used to be 50 years ago, where before globalization of finance, etc. Because to imagine any country breaking free from the global system and creating its own economy, etc., is very hard. Now, why would you do that? Well, because as long as you are within the global system, there are certain things you have to do. There are certain ways you have to behave. You cannot break with the free transfer of free access of finance, etc., which is part of what creates the web that we have today. So that also means that radical imagining becomes either very radical or small steps. And I'm for both. I think, again, to refer to Thomas Piketty, that pushes for a tax on both on the multi-rich and on financial transaction globally. I think these are small steps, but they are actually quite big steps. But sort of they sound small, but even to start thinking about the welfare system globally makes an awful lot of sense. But radical would only happen if countries dare to break out of the global system, and that is a big ask for anyone, because people will suffer. I mean, so that is so to think of that kind of radical solution, it's very hard to be specific of what that would mean, because it would have to be egalitarian, but it will also have to be rebuilding something else. So that is or as my mentor Henry Bernstein always says, I can point out the problems, I can't see the solutions. And that is of course not a nice place to be in, but nevertheless there is something to it. Structural, but it also means that the idea of structural transition. Now, firstly, it would be different, because agriculture is capitalist. There isn't this big capital that can be created and put in there. And we don't. No country today needs structural transition of the kind that doesn't create good jobs. So to have a transition that create good jobs, and we can't all be China exporting to be the factory of the whole world. So to have that requires a way of thinking where profits are much smaller, where we sell to each other in country, etc., etc. So these are big issues. Now, returning to the first question, monopolizing, and I'm not totally sure I got all the nuances, but of course, well, that is part of. I mean, discrimination is not some evil person sitting manipulating. It is people taking action for their own benefit, and those in power, when they do that, reinforce the powerful systems. To stop discrimination also means stopping the discrimination of fellow workers against you, for example, because they have a small advantage by discriminating against you, and to stop doing that, allowing you to have access to the same jobs as them, is against their immediate interest, and only if they can see that in the long run it will be in everyone's interest to stop, it will work. So there's so all social groups monopolize, and to eradicate racism, casteism is both a structural economic issue, but it is also an issue of what Gramsci calls common sense of dealing with what is commonly accepted as the way things are, and how it should be instead. So there's a big sort of discursive job to take on here as well. I don't know if that answered your questions, but that's what I could say.
Can we questions online?
Yes. Shall I try and find them here? Or will you read them up? Or no, I see. All I have is. Yeah. And this is not something I can list, but a hell of a lot, because I think to do proper field work today, it has to be multi-sided for starters. You cannot only work in a village and think you understand everything. You will have to understand where people go and why they go and how it is there, what they get from there. So you have to work in different places. And of course, it's not so easy that all people from one village go to the same place. So it's actually quite a big job to do a proper field work. It's not something I think you can do easily over 1 year. It is over time you can do that kind of things. Of course, the students stop you from starting, but if you want to cover the complexity properly, field work is an ongoing affair. You also have to be open-minded, and we all have our positionality and what we focus in on. I can just to tell a story. I was in UP first in Jaunpur in 92, 93, and I mean I worked with there. I was there for 6 months. I worked with the Dalits. I thought I knew what was going on, and then next year Mayawati and BSP won the election. I hadn't spotted that one, and coming back, I realized that one auxiliary nurse or health worker was the local BSP leader, and that her presence had actually changed, or BSP's election and her presence enabled the Dalits to behave in a different way, dare to take action in a different way, because there's no way the police would come and beat them up if they went on strike, etc., etc. So, and I asked myself, why didn't I spot that? Well, I didn't look out for it. if I looked for political activities, I looked at the men. I looked at the ones that were local, not the one that worked in the town. So I wasn't open-ended enough in my way of looking. Well, and I don't think I'm a bad field worker, but I was too rigid in what I focused on. And I think everyone will have to deal with one's positionality, male, female, caste, etc., and urban, rural backgrounds, and try and transcend that, and be genuinely open for difference. So that is the main advice I can give, and that also involves very often not staying with the farmers, but staying with the Dalits or the Adivasis, because you have to be very lucky if Dalit and Adivasis are willing to open up to you if you stay with the farmers. Of course, you then have the opposite problem. If you stay with the Dalits, that the farmers might not open up to you. So you have to take your pick, and maybe. So I think my preferred way of doing it now is to start staying with the Dalits, and then move to the farmers. Though maybe it's better the other way. I don't know. But these are all tricky issues. But it's about that openness, really. I think more than not being hemmed in by system, but of course also daring to analyze. Yeah. I have to admit I don't remember woman's definition, but what we really want to emphasize is that opposed to intersectionality, which in its worst forms is we have class oppression here, we have gender oppression here, we have race oppression here, and they meet here. And that is terrible because there are three types of oppression. Now, it is not how all intersectionality studies are, but some are. Opposed to this, we want to emphasize that one cannot divide them. One cannot think of caste oppression as separate from class oppression, as separate from gender oppression. They all work together at the same time, and ought to be analyzed as inextricably linked or part of the same. That so it's not something you accumulate. It is there all the time together, and to do what I did today I mean, then when you describe things that you have to make shortcuts. I took class first and then cast afterwards is actually a bad way of working, because you got to have it, because it sort of signals that you can separate things. But I don't think it is possible to think, I mean, cast different, separate from class. With racial capitalism, you cannot think racism and capitalism. It has worked out in a particular way that is a whole. So. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No. Yes, and of course there's also class divisions within a caste. So I'm not saying we have a blueprint and always it will pan out the same way. But I think one has to always see it as being part of it. So I did just something slightly different. I did an analysis of the farmers' farm law movements, which, I mean, fantastic movements, etc., etc. But I felt the need to point out that it was actually amazing that so many different social groups could unite behind this. That one should never take for granted that all farmers have the same interests, and that Dalits working for the farmers have the same interest. One has to understand why in this particular case they could unite. because sometimes class trumps caste, sometimes resistance against the government policy trumps all sorts of other things. But instead of just assuming that is the case, in my view, you're better off analyzing why in this case was it like that. So, well, I think that for, unless there are jobs outside, whether people like it or not, they will have to take up agriculture. And of course, I mean, you can go along and do time pass for that many years, but if there's no other job for you, what to do? So I'm aware that young people from the farming community do not want to engage in agriculture, and I totally understand it, because I mean the figures show that it's you can, in most parts of the country, for most farmers, you're better off not doing it. There are of course farmers that actually do really well. My colleague Sreya Sinha study of big capsids farmers in Punjab shows accumulation trajectories that are very good for them. And both those that stick solely to farming, because then they go for crops, a complicated pattern where they partly go for high value crops and some security crops, but they can do it. And they seek to maximize the amount of land they farm. Others don't do that. They farm a bit and send their sons and daughters off to Canada, and then that will take care of the family business in the future. So there are different ways, but so it's not all that wants to leave agriculture. But within, as it is now, you don't make a lot of money within agriculture. And of course, in a system where prices are set, where some prices for some people are set by the MSPs, it is a government issue whether to increase what you can earn from agriculture, roll it out, etc. And as I sort of have said before, as far as I can see, unless something fantastic happens in the non-agricultural sector, the only socially cohesive-ish way is to make agriculture more profitable. And I say ish because that is good for the farmers. It is not necessarily good for the laborers. But the need for people to be able to make a living in the countryside, without that, the pressure on fairly low wage jobs outside of agriculture will just increase. Yeah, David Moss, who's a colleague of mine at SOAS, seeks to straddle Marxism and Weberianism. So he, at the one hand, actually has a fairly sort of standard economic class analysis at the base, and then he adds to that saying that is not how people take action. They take action on other issues of corruptions, of well-being, on discrimination, etc. That is a layer separated for him, and he looks at the relations within that field. And it's, I mean there are many different ways of doing social science research, and I have a lot of respect for this way. It's not the way I would do it. I wouldn't split things up the way he does, but he has good results from he knows what he's talking about well enough to make this approach work quite well. I think what you miss in that is a link to how capitalism developed overall and your analysis. And that means, in a sense, the engine that drives relations over time is being slightly cut off from your analysis. And that certainly means you can explain less of change in relation to that. then he explains a lot of change in relation to other issues. So, I mean, you win some, you lose some.